Dear learners, welcome back to WSE True Stories, where learning English turns into an inspiring journey through the lives of real people who changed the world. Today, you'll not only grow your listening and vocabulary skills, but also discover what it truly means to lead with peace, even in the face of exile, loss, and unthinkable pressure. This is the extraordinary story of His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama, a man born in a remote Himalayan village, recognized as the reincarnation of a spiritual leader while still a toddler, and forced to flee his homeland before he turned 25. You may have seen his gentle smile on posters or heard his quotes about compassion, but behind that calm presence lies a story full of political storms, spiritual depth, and personal courage. He didn't rise through violence, wealth, or ambition. He became a global icon through kindness, even while carrying the weight of a people's pain and a country's hopes. In a world where conflict often grabs the microphone, he offered a quiet voice, and it echoed across the globe. What happens when one man chooses inner peace over power? When he chooses to forgive, even after losing everything? Let's step into his journey. Because sometimes, the softest voice changes the world the most. The story begins in a humble village called Taksar, nestled in the rugged hills of northeastern Tibet. It was 1935, a time when the outside world barely touched these high, windswept lands. Life was simple, grounded in farming, family, and faith. Into this quiet world, a boy named Lama Thondup was born to a farming family. He was the fifth of 16 children, though only 7 survived into childhood. His family wasn't rich or powerful. They lived in a modest home with clay walls and prayer flags fluttering in the cold mountain wind. But this boy was different, and the signs, according to Tibetan Buddhist tradition, were unmistakable. After the 13th Dalai Lama passed away in 1933, senior monks began a sacred search. They followed visions, dreams, and spiritual signs. These clues led them, miraculously, to the doorstep of young Lama's home. When the monks arrived, the 2-year-old boy instantly recognized their possessions from a previous life. He correctly identified items that once belonged to the 13th Dalai Lama, showing no hesitation. For the monks, this was no coincidence. It was the sign they were searching for. At the age of just 4, Lama Thondup was declared the 14th Dalai Lama, the spiritual and political leader of Tibet, believed to be the reincarnation of his predecessor. From that moment, his childhood changed completely. He was taken to the capital, Lhasa, where he began years of intense study in Buddhist philosophy, logic, meditation, and languages. While most children were playing with toys, he was debating scriptures with scholars and memorizing ancient texts. His new home was the Potala Palace, an enormous structure overlooking the city, both majestic and isolating. He was now not just a child, but a symbol of faith, identity, and continuity for an entire nation. But deep inside, he remained a gentle soul, full of curiosity and warmth. He loved fixing watches, asking questions, and sometimes sneaking in moments of laughter with his tutors. His character, even in those early years, stood out, deeply humble, unusually wise, and always calm under pressure. And while Tibet respected him as a holy figure, storm clouds were beginning to gather on the horizon. The world around them was shifting fast, and soon, young Lama's quiet life in the mountains would be swept into a global storm. Because being the Dalai Lama was no ordinary role. And soon, the boy who once played by the riverbanks of Taksar would face decisions that would shape not only his fate, but the fate of a nation. But his journey was just beginning. By the time the Dalai Lama was a teenager, it was clear that his role would go far beyond spiritual guidance. The winds of political change were howling across Asia. And Tibet, long isolated from the world, was becoming a focus of geopolitical tension. It was 1949. The People's Republic of China had just been established, and its leaders were turning their attention to Tibet. By 1950, Chinese troops crossed the eastern borders into Tibetan territory. The peaceful highlands were suddenly under military pressure. The 14th Dalai Lama was only 15 years old when he was asked to take on full political leadership of Tibet. Imagine it, a boy, barely old enough to finish school, suddenly thrust into negotiations, strategies, and heartbreaking decisions about his nation's future. He had to grow up overnight. While some pushed for war, others urged diplomacy. The young Dalai Lama, guided by his deeply rooted Buddhist values of peace and nonviolence, leaned toward dialogue. He didn't want his people to suffer. He believed in understanding, even with those who threatened him. So, he sent envoys to China, hoping to find a peaceful resolution. But the results were painful. In 1951, under duress and with Chinese troops occupying key regions, a 17-point agreement was signed, formally bringing Tibet under Chinese sovereignty. Though the Chinese government insisted this was a peaceful liberation, many Tibetans felt betrayed, invaded, and afraid. And the young Dalai Lama? He was heartbroken. He was caught in an impossible position, trying to honor Buddhist teachings of compassion while watching his people lose their freedom. Trying to lead a nation with wisdom, while others brought guns. But it was during this time that his deep inner fire was lit. He began to study not just Buddhist teachings, but global politics, science, and world history. He saw that to truly lead his people, he would need to understand the world beyond Tibet. He invited scholars, scientists, and spiritual leaders from other traditions to share knowledge. His mind expanded, and so did his vision for what peace could mean, even on a global scale. He often said that compassion is not weakness, it is a strength that requires courage. And he was about to prove just how strong it could be. As unrest grew inside Tibet, so did the risks. Chinese authorities tightened control. Religious practices were restricted. Monasteries were watched. The Tibetan people began to rise in protest, and whispers of rebellion reached the ears of Chinese generals. In the capital of Lhasa, tension reached a boiling point. It was no longer a question of if something would happen, but when. And at the center of it all stood the Dalai Lama, just 23 years old, trapped between loyalty to his people and a regime that now saw him as a potential threat. He faced a terrifying reality. If he stayed, he could be silenced, or worse. But if he left, he would become a spiritual leader without a country. A choice was coming. A moment that would define his life, and change the destiny of Tibet forever. And it would happen under the cover of night. It was March 1959. The streets of Lhasa were boiling with unrest. Thousands of Tibetans had surrounded the Norbulinka Palace, desperate to protect their spiritual leader from what they feared was an impending Chinese abduction. Inside, the Dalai Lama faced an impossible decision. After days of tension and secret meetings, he made one of the most painful choices of his life, to flee his homeland. Disguised as a soldier, with a rifle slung over his shoulder, he slipped out under cover of darkness, leaving behind the land he had vowed to protect. With a small group of loyal followers, he crossed the treacherous Himalayas on foot, enduring freezing temperatures, exhaustion, and the constant threat of being captured or killed. After 2 weeks of peril, he reached the border of India. Prime Minister Nehru granted him asylum. the Dalai Lama had escaped. But Tibet was not so lucky. In the months that followed, Chinese forces crushed the Tibetan uprising. Thousands were killed. Monasteries were destroyed. And the Tibetan people were plunged into a long, painful chapter of repression. Meanwhile, in India, the Dalai Lama found himself in an unfamiliar position, a leader without a nation. For the first time, he felt truly alone, exiled, grieving, and uncertain of what came next. At just 23 years old, the young monk who had once lived in the splendor of the Potala Palace now sat in a small guest house in Dharamshala, facing the greatest question of his life. How do you lead a people in exile? The early years were hard. The Tibetan refugee community was scattered and traumatized. Many were poor, sick, or struggling to adapt to their new surroundings. The Dalai Lama worked tirelessly, not just as a figurehead, but as a hands-on organizer. He helped establish schools for Tibetan children, ensuring they could still learn their language, history, and religion. He built monastic institutions in exile, preserving Tibetan Buddhism from extinction. He met with world leaders, often with little recognition or support, trying to raise awareness about Tibet's plight. And there were many failures. Some countries were unwilling to get involved. Others were polite, but non-committal. His calls for justice were often met with silence, or worse, indifference. Even within his own community, there were challenges. Some Tibetans urged a return to armed resistance. Others questioned whether nonviolence could ever achieve results. At times, it must have felt like everything was slipping away. But the Dalai Lama held firm. He believed, with unwavering conviction, that violence would only bring more suffering. Instead, he doubled down on his core values: compassion, dialogue, and peace. In his own words, "Our enemies are our greatest teachers. They show us where we still have work to do inside ourselves." Instead of turning bitter, he became softer, more open, more determined. This period of hardship became a time of deep growth. He studied not just Buddhist texts but engaged with modern science, psychology, and philosophy. He opened his heart to the world, not just as a religious figure, but as a human being who believed that the only true victory is a peaceful mind. And slowly, the world began to listen. He started getting invitations to speak at universities, peace summits, interfaith gatherings. His gentle humor, radiant warmth, and fierce wisdom stood out. He wasn't just the leader of an exiled nation, he was becoming something more. A global voice of compassion. But the road ahead was still long, and a defining moment was still to come. One that would test his deepest values, threaten his identity, and demand the most courageous decision of his life. By the late 1980s, the Dalai Lama had been living in exile for nearly 30 years. He had created a functioning Tibetan government in exile, preserved much of the culture and religion, and slowly gained international recognition. But still, Tibet remained under Chinese control, and millions of Tibetans continued to suffer in silence. For many leaders, this would be the moment to escalate, to rally support for independence, to call for rebellion, to raise fists instead of prayer beads. But the Dalai Lama was not like other leaders. He believed that anger only darkens the truth. And so, in 1987, standing in front of the U.S. Congressional Human Rights Caucus in Washington, D.C., he made a move that stunned the world and infuriated many within his own people. He offered a peaceful solution. Not full independence. Not war. But what he called the middle way approach. In this historic proposal, the Dalai Lama did not ask for separation from China, but genuine autonomy for the Tibetan people, freedom to practice their religion, preserve their culture, and live with dignity within the framework of the People's Republic of China. It was a bold, controversial move. Some Tibetan exiles felt betrayed, that he was giving up too much, asking for too little. Others believed it was the only path forward that didn't lead to endless bloodshed. But the Dalai Lama saw farther. He said, "We must look beyond short-term emotions. Peace does not come through hatred, it comes through understanding." This speech marked a defining turn in his life. From this point forward, he was no longer just a spiritual leader or an exiled politician. He was becoming a global symbol of nonviolent resistance. The following year, in 1988, he refined the Middle Way proposal in Strasbourg, France, outlining how Tibet could coexist peacefully within China, with a democratic system, environmental protections, and religious freedom. But while the world praised him, China rejected the offer outright. Officials accused him of being a splittist, claiming he still wanted independence through stealth. The door to negotiation slammed shut. Worse still, in 1989, violence erupted again in Lhasa, as peaceful Tibetan protests were met with brutal crackdowns by Chinese forces. It was one of the darkest moments in recent Tibetan history. And yet, in the middle of this tension, something remarkable happened. In December 1989, just months after the Tiananmen Square massacre, the Nobel Committee awarded the Dalai Lama the Nobel Peace Prize. The world had heard him. The Nobel Committee praised his consistent resistance to the use of violence and his efforts to find peaceful solutions based upon tolerance and mutual respect. It was a moment of profound validation, not just for the Dalai Lama, but for every Tibetan who had chosen patience over rage, dialogue over destruction. Standing before the world in Oslo, Norway, he spoke not with triumph, but with humility. He dedicated the prize to the oppressed everywhere, from those suffering under occupation to those crushed by poverty and injustice. He said, "I am just a simple monk, no more, no less. If my words have meaning, it is because they come from the heart." The award changed everything. His face became known to millions. His teachings were translated into dozens of languages. Doors that had once been closed were now opening in universities, parliaments, and spiritual gatherings across the globe. But most importantly, the Dalai Lama had found his true calling, not just as the voice of a nation, but as a messenger of peace for all humanity. Still, this newfound fame brought new challenges. Critics emerged. Some accused him of being unrealistic. Others questioned his willingness to engage with China despite repeated failures. And inside, he still carried the weight of millions of exiled dreams, people who had looked to him for a path home. The question now was, could compassion alone be enough to change the course of history? The answer would lie in the next chapter of his life, a chapter that would test not just his politics, but the very core of his being. The Nobel Peace Prize had elevated the Dalai Lama onto the world stage. His name now appeared alongside the likes of Martin Luther King Jr. and Mahatma Gandhi. Millions listened when he spoke. World leaders invited him to their parliaments. Celebrities sought his wisdom. But with this attention came an uncomfortable truth: Tibet was still no closer to freedom. Despite his global influence, the Chinese government continued to view him as a dangerous separatist. They refused to meet, refused to negotiate, and continued their strict control over Tibetan religious life, language, and movement. And so, behind the gentle smile and soft-spoken interviews, a storm was growing inside him. He had always taught detachment, to accept life as it is, to let go of desire. But how could he ask his people to accept injustice? How could he preach patience when monks were disappearing, temples were being destroyed, and Tibetan identity was being erased? In private moments, the Dalai Lama admitted to close confidants. "There are days I feel I've failed. So many still suffer, and I remain only a voice, not a savior." And yet, the world continued to look to him for answers. At universities, students asked, "Why not fight back?" In refugee camps, children asked, "When can we go home?" It was in these moments that he faced his most painful inner battle, not with a government, but with himself. Because the truth was, the Dalai Lama could have changed course. He could have endorsed the growing number of Tibetan youth who were calling for independence at any cost. He could have used his global platform to demand action, sanctions, protests. The anger was there, boiling, waiting to be lit. And many begged him to do just that. But in one of the most difficult decisions of his life, the Dalai Lama reaffirmed his commitment to nonviolence, and to the middle way. He chose the harder road, the slower road. The one that doesn't make headlines, doesn't promise quick victories, but holds true to a deeper truth. He explained it this way: "If I choose violence, I may gain a piece of land. But I will lose the soul of our people." In 2008, on the 49th anniversary of the Tibetan uprising, the world watched as riots broke out across Tibet once again. The Chinese government responded with force. Hundreds were arrested. Communications were cut. The situation grew dire. And yet, at the very height of the crisis, the Dalai Lama stood before the press, not to condemn, not to accuse, but to plead for peace. He wept openly. He said, "Violence is against human nature. Please, do not lose your way." Many criticized him. Some younger Tibetans even burned their refugee papers in protest. They said his way was too slow, too passive. That compassion was no longer enough. But the Dalai Lama stood firm. Because this was his greatest act of leadership, to absorb the anger, the impatience, the grief, and still choose love. It was not weakness. It was strength forged over decades of inner discipline, spiritual practice, and heartbreaking experience. He did not seek a spotlight, but when it found him, he used it not to fight, but to heal. Through it all, he maintained one radical belief, that even his enemies were worthy of compassion. "The Chinese are not our enemies," he said. "They are our human brothers and sisters, temporarily misled." In a world increasingly divided by fear and rage, that kind of message felt revolutionary. His brave decision wasn't one explosive act, but 1,000 daily acts of restraint, of holding back the fire in order to protect the flame. By the time he was in his 70s, the Dalai Lama had traveled to more than 60 countries, spoken at the United Nations, met with U.S. presidents, and been embraced by millions, not because of what he demanded, but because of what he stood for. And still, every morning, he awoke at 3 a.m. to meditate and pray, not for power, not for revenge, but for clarity and compassion. But as age crept in, another challenge loomed. What would happen after the Dalai Lama? Could the Tibetan people survive without his guidance? Would his message endure in a world that often forgets its prophets too soon? This question would lead him to make one more transformative choice. The Dalai Lama never returned to the Potala Palace, his childhood home and symbol of Tibetan leadership. But what he built in exile may be even more enduring. In Dharamshala, India, a small hill town tucked into the Himalayan foothills, he helped create a living, breathing version of Tibet. The government in exile was formed. Monasteries were rebuilt. Tibetan schools opened their doors to children who had walked across mountains to find a future. He didn't just preserve a culture, he gave it a second life. Today, Tibetan exiles speak their language, wear their traditional clothes, and practice their religion, not as memory, but as living heritage. That's an extraordinary accomplishment in a time when so many indigenous cultures are fading. But the Dalai Lama's impact didn't stop at his borders. By the 1990s and 2000s, he had become one of the most recognizable spiritual leaders in the world, despite having no military, no nation, and no material power. His only tools were his smile, his teachings, and the sincerity behind every word he spoke. He brought Buddhism into the modern world in a way no one had before. Instead of treating it as a religion of rituals, he presented it as a science of the mind, something compatible with reason, psychology, and even neuroscience. He opened dialogues with leading scientists, philosophers, and educators. In one famous moment, he told an audience at MIT, "If science proves a Buddhist belief wrong, then Buddhism must change." That statement shocked both monks and scholars, but it revealed his commitment to truth over tradition. This approach made his teachings accessible to millions of people outside the faith. You didn't have to become a Buddhist to learn from the Dalai Lama, you just had to be human. Through his books, lectures, and interviews, he taught simple but profound principles. My religion is kindness. Be kind whenever possible. It is always possible. Happiness is not something ready-made. It comes from your own actions. These messages resonated in boardrooms, classrooms, and therapy offices. They appeared on T-shirts, posters, and Instagram quotes. He became a symbol not of dogma, but of universal values. His influence also reached into politics, though not in the usual way. He met with U.S. presidents from George H.W. Bush to Barack Obama. He addressed the European Parliament. He was awarded over 150 honorary degrees and international recognitions. But he always insisted, "I am a simple monk. I do not seek independence. I seek autonomy and peace." His refusal to hate, his insistence on dialogue, embarrassed the powerful and inspired the oppressed. He became a moral compass in a time of rising nationalism and polarization. But perhaps his greatest achievement was in how he transformed pain into purpose. Instead of becoming bitter over his exile, he used it as a platform to teach forgiveness. Instead of letting Tibet become a forgotten tragedy, he made it a symbol of resilience. And instead of leading with force, he led with unshakable inner peace, proving that true leadership begins inside. By the time he reached his 80s, the Dalai Lama was no longer just the spiritual head of Tibetan Buddhists, he was a global elder, invited to guide conversations on ethics, education, and environmental stewardship. Even the youth, growing up in a digital age far removed from his past, found wisdom in his laughter, his humility, and his insistence that compassion is strength. But he knew time was limited. And in his later years, he faced a final, urgent task: to prepare the world for life after him. Would his legacy survive without him? Could a message of peace continue to grow in a world addicted to conflict? This would lead him to his most controversial and forward-thinking decision yet. As the Dalai Lama grew older, a quiet urgency crept into his public talks. Though his laughter remained infectious, his eyes now carried a different kind of weight, the burden of ensuring that his life's message would outlive his body. In Tibetan Buddhism, the Dalai Lama is not just a teacher. He is believed to be the reincarnation of compassion itself, the human form of Avalokiteshvara, the bodhisattva who vows to remain in the world until all suffering ends. Traditionally, after a Dalai Lama passes away, a search begins for his rebirth, a child showing signs of spiritual continuity. But this time, things were different. The current Dalai Lama made headlines around the world when he said, "Maybe the next Dalai Lama won't be born in Tibet. Maybe it will be a woman. Maybe there won't be another Dalai Lama at all." It was a stunning statement. Some saw it as heresy. Others saw it as courage. In truth, it was a deeply strategic and humble act. He knew China hoped to control the next reincarnation, to install a state-approved figure. Rather than let that happen, he said, it may be better to end the institution. It was the ultimate detachment from ego, letting go of the very title that had defined his life. And it showed, once again, his commitment to truth, peace, and people over power. So what remains, if there is no next Dalai Lama? His values. At the heart of everything he taught, every speech, every smile, every sit-down with a world leader, were a few unwavering beliefs. That compassion is not weakness, it's the greatest strength we can develop. That peace begins within, not with governments or treaties. That every person matters, regardless of race, religion, or nationality. That dialogue is always better than violence, no matter how long it takes. And perhaps most importantly, that the human heart is capable of infinite change, if we only slow down and listen. In a world filled with noise, fear, and division, his quiet voice has become a kind of compass, reminding us that being kind is not naive, it's revolutionary. Today, his messages are studied in schools, quoted in United Nations meetings, and printed on bookmarks given out in yoga classes. But they also echo in more personal places, in the decision to forgive a friend, to speak gently to a child, to breathe before reacting in anger. He once said, "If you think you are too small to make a difference, try sleeping with a mosquito." His life proved that idea true. But one chapter still remains. The world had watched the Dalai Lama for decades. He had escaped, built anew, inspired millions. Now, as he enters the final season of his life, one question remains, perhaps the most profound of all. What does it mean to let go, with peace? Dear learners, the Dalai Lama's story isn't just about exile, politics, or ancient tradition. It's about something much deeper, how a single life, led with courage and compassion, can quietly move the entire world. He was a young boy taken from his family, crowned a spiritual king, then forced to flee his homeland with nothing but robes and hope. He could have turned bitter. He could have vanished into silence. But instead, he chose to lead not with power, but with presence. Not with anger, but with understanding. Not with division, but with a smile. And that's something we can all carry with us, no matter where we live, what language we speak, or what struggles we face. You may never walk the halls of the UN, or sit across from a president. But in the quiet moments, in how you speak to others, how you forgive, how you stand for what's right, you carry the same power he did. Be kind whenever possible, he said. It is always possible. So if this story touched you, share it with someone who might need a moment of peace or courage today. Let's keep the spirit of compassion alive, in our words, our actions, and in the kind of world we're building, together. Leave a comment below. What did you learn from the Dalai Lama's journey? What values matter most to you? Like this video, subscribe for more powerful true stories, and join our learning community. Until next time, keep learning, keep reflecting, and never underestimate the strength of a gentle voice. Goodbye for now.